My parents bought my sister a penthouse in the center of New York while I cleaned toilets, then called me failure. So I smiled, made one move they never recovered from. The first time I saw the keys to that penthouse, my hands were shaking, not because I was about to hold them, but because my sister was. She was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights flickering behind her like a trophy she didn't have to earn. Meanwhile, I was scrubbing the same stubborn stain on the bathroom floor of a downtown diner, my knuckles raw and my uniform soaked in sweat. My name's Jake, I'm 27, and I've been living in the shadow of my family's twisted version of success for as long as I can remember. Mom remarried when I was 15, a man who made it clear from day one that my worth was measured by how useful I was, and how much I didn't get in the way of his perfect picture. My sister, Emily, 22, was his golden child. She got the designer clothes, the private tutors, and now, this penthouse that overlooks Central Park. Me? I got the cold shoulder and the endless hours cleaning toilets in cramped, grimy bathrooms, far from any skyline or spotlight. Every morning, I wake up in my cramped apartment, the peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights reminding me where I belong. The smell of bleach and industrial cleaner clings to my hands like a badge I never asked to wear. At family dinners, I sit at the end of the table, silent and invisible, while Emily talks about her new apartment as if it's a medal she earned by just being born. Mom and Dad exchange proud glances, their eyes sliding over me like I'm a mistake they keep forgetting to fix. There's a pattern I've learned to recognize: the subtle dismissals, the forced smiles, the way they shift conversations away whenever I try to talk about my life. Last Thanksgiving, Mom handed Emily a set of keys with a flourish, calling it a fresh start, while I was left clearing the table and scrubbing the kitchen floor. The look in my mother's eyes wasn't pride, it was disappointment. In me. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. The way my sister's smile faltered when she thought no one was watching. The slight tremble in her voice when she bragged about her new life. And in me, a quiet storm was growing, fueled by years of being overlooked and underestimated. That night, as I locked the diner's bathroom door behind me and stared up at the glittering skyline from the grimy alleyway, I realized I was done playing their game. I had one move left, and it was one they would never see coming. Every morning, the stale air of my apartment greets me like a silent reprimand. The faded wallpaper peels in jagged strips, curling away from the damp walls as if desperate to escape. I reach for the light switch, and the flickering fluorescent bulb buzzes to life, casting a harsh, unflattering glow over the cracked mirror. My reflection blinks back tired eyes, a ghost of the person my family pretends I am, or rather, pretends not to see. I shuffle to the bathroom, the linoleum cold beneath my bare feet, and splash water on my face. The chill is a jolt, but it doesn't shake off the weight pressing down on my chest. I grab my worn uniform from the chair, the fabric stiff with old stains, and pull it over my head. The smell of bleach clings to the sleeves, a reminder of the night before. Another shift spent scrubbing toilets until my hands cracked and bled. I catch a glimpse of my hands in the mirror, raw, red, and trembling slightly. They look like hands that belong to someone else, someone forgotten. On my way out, I pass by my phone, buzzing silently with messages I never answer. Not because I don't want to, but because I don't expect anyone on the other end to care. The silence in my apartment echoes louder than any text. Work is a cramped, fluorescent-lit nightmare. The diner's bathroom is a narrow cage of peeling paint and grimy tiles. Every day I wage a battle against stubborn stains and foul smells, the smell of industrial cleaner mixing with sweat and regret. The customers never see me. They only see the spotless sink or the sparkling floor. I am invisible except when something goes wrong. A clogged toilet, a misplaced mop, a forgotten paper towel. Then suddenly, my presence is acknowledged, not with thanks, but with irritation. At night, when I finally drag myself home, I'm too exhausted to eat, too hollow to speak. My phone lights up again, this time, a photo of Emily's penthouse balcony, the city sprawling endlessly behind her. Mom's caption glitters with pride. Our shining star. I stare at it, the edges of my vision blurring. It's a world apart from the cramped, silent misery I return to. Family dinners are the worst. The dining room is bright and polished, the table set with china that Emily never touches. She sits at the head, narrating stories about her new life, her voice light and full of entitlement. Mom and Dad exchanged those knowing looks, the ones that slice through me like cold knives. I sit at the end, a shadow folded into the corner, my voice swallowed by the hum of conversation. Last Sunday, as Emily recounted a cocktail party she attended in her penthouse, I reached out to share a small victory, my first paycheck from a part-time writing gig. The moment I opened my mouth, Mom's eyes flicked away. Not with interest, but with dismissiveness so sharp it knocked the words from my throat. Dad cleared his throat, steering the talk back to Emily's latest accomplishment. The unspoken message was clear. My wins were invisible, my efforts insignificant. After dinner, I retreated to the kitchen to clear the table. The clinking of silverware against plates was a metronome of isolation. I wiped the counters, noticing the faint smudge of lipstick on a glass Emily left behind. It was a small trace of her presence, yet it felt like a reminder of everything I wasn't, a privilege unearned, a life I wasn't meant to have. The dishwasher hummed as I loaded the final plate. The room empty, but for the echoes of laughter I wasn't part of. The nights are the loneliest. I lie in bed, the ceiling fan circling above like a restless sentinel. The silence presses in, thick and suffocating. I think about the future, about the endless cycle of cleaning and being unseen. The ache in my chest grows, not from physical exhaustion alone, but from the slow erosion of self. I reach out to the dark, searching for a lifeline, but find only the cold weight of expectation and neglect. One evening, returning from my shift, I passed Emily and Mom in the lobby of our building. They were wrapped in a bubble of shared secrets and laughter, a world I was barred from entering. I smiled politely, but their eyes slid past me, as if I were a ghost haunting their perfect scene. The elevator doors closed before I could say a word, sealing me away in silence. In the weeks that followed, I noticed the subtle shifts. The way Dad's glance lingered on Emily's achievements while erasing me. The way Mom's smiles didn't quite reach her eyes when she looked my way. I became an afterthought, a shadow in the background of their carefully curated lives. Each slight chipped away at my resolve, but beneath the fatigue, a new feeling stirred. A quiet, simmering awareness that the game was rigged and that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as invisible as they believed. As I lay awake one night, the hum of the city bleeding through my window, I realized something fundamental was changing. The pain, the neglect, the exhaustion. They were no longer chains but clues. And I was beginning to see the path they hoped I'd never find. That Friday night started like any other. The diner's closing bell rang sharp and unforgiving, and I wiped down the counters, the rag damp and gritty in my hands. My muscles ached from the shift, but my mind was restless, chewing over the tiny victories I'd quietly claimed that week. An extra story published online, a few dollars saved, a plan taking shape. I was halfway through locking the front door when my phone buzzed in my pocket. A new message, from Mom. I hesitated before pulling it out. Usually, it was more photos of Emily's penthouse, more subtle reminders of the gulf between us. But this time, the message was different. A short text, clipped and cold. Dinner tomorrow night. It's important. No smiley face, no warmth, just those 4 words. The kind of message that made my stomach knot. The next evening, I arrived at their apartment building, the polished marble lobby smelling faintly of lilies and money. I pressed the buzzer for their floor and waited as the elevator hummed upward. When the door slid open, I stepped into the glimmering hallway, the soft carpet muffling my footsteps. Mom greeted me with a tight-lipped smile, her eyes unreadable. They led me into the living room, where Emily lounged on the leather sofa, the city skyline behind her like a backdrop to a play I was never cast in. Dad stood by the window, arms crossed, his jaw clenched. The air was heavy, the silence so thick it felt like a physical thing pressing down on my shoulders. Mom broke the quiet. "Jake, we need to talk about the future." Her voice was steady, but there was a sharp edge beneath it that made my throat dry. I nodded, sitting down reluctantly on the edge of a chair, my hands gripping the arms until my knuckles whitened. Dad stepped forward and pulled a thin envelope from his pocket. He handed it to me without a word. I opened it slowly, the paper crisp between my fingers. Inside was a letter from a prestigious university, an acceptance letter for a business program, complete with a scholarship offer. For a moment, I stared at the letter, disbelief washing over me like cold water. This was the kind of opportunity I'd dreamed about but never dared to expect. But then Dad's next words cut through the surprise. "This is your chance to turn things around, Jake. We can't keep supporting you if you don't take this seriously. Emily's already set on her path, and it's time you did the same." The words hit me like a slap. Less an offer, more an ultimatum. I looked at Mom, searching for some sign of encouragement or warmth, but her eyes were distant, almost indifferent. Then, in a voice I barely recognized as my own, I asked, "So, if I don't take this, what happens?" Dad's smile was thin, almost cruel. "Then you're on your own. We can't keep propping you up when you refuse to help yourself." Suddenly, the room felt smaller, the walls closing in. The familiar ache of rejection twisted in my chest, sharper and more brutal than before. I swallowed hard, my throat tight, as a numbness spread from my fingers to my toes. My hands trembled, and I clenched them into fists to stop the shaking. Emily scoffed lightly from the couch. "Maybe if you stopped wasting time scrubbing toilets and actually did something worthwhile, you wouldn't be in this mess." Her words weren't just casual insults. They were knives, thrown with practiced ease. I sat frozen, the harsh fluorescent light bouncing off the glass table between us. The letter felt heavier than any weight I'd carried before, a symbol of their conditional love and my precarious place in their world. For hours after I left, I replayed the conversation in my mind, the sting of their words mingling with the strange, bitter taste of clarity. I realized then that the family I thought I belonged to had already decided where I fit in, and it wasn't anywhere near their shining penthouse or their carefully constructed lives. That night, lying on my threadbare mattress, I stared at the cracked ceiling and felt the last flicker of denial snap. The truth was undeniable now. They didn't see me. Not really. And no matter what I did, I was alone in this fight. In the weeks that followed that crushing dinner, the atmosphere around me thickened, like a storm gathering just out of sight. The tension didn't announce itself loudly. It crept in through small, sharp moments that cut deeper than any shouting match could. At work, the diner's manager, who once tolerated my tired jokes and quiet presence, started snapping at me over minor mistakes, a misplaced mop bucket, an overlooked soap dispenser. One afternoon, after a grueling double shift, he barked, "If you can't keep up, maybe this job's not for you." His words echoed the verdict I was used to hearing at home, but coming from someone who barely knew my story, they felt like a punch to the gut. At home, the distance grew wider and colder. Emily's visits became less about family and more like performances. One evening, she invited her friends over, filling the apartment with laughter and music that pounded through the thin walls. I was relegated to my room, told to keep it down. As I lay on my bed, the muffled party sounds swirling above, I felt the sting of exclusion press against my skin like a physical barrier. The penthouse wasn't just a place for Emily. It was a fortress that kept me out. Mom's behavior shifted too, but in subtler, more painful ways. She stopped asking about my writing, the one thing I clung to as proof I could carve my own path. Instead, her eyes flicked away whenever I mentioned any progress, like she was rehearsing a polite disinterest. One afternoon, she promised to help me with an application for a local literary workshop but canceled last minute with a vague excuse about being too busy. The disappointment settled in my chest like a stone, heavier than anything I'd scrubbed or cleaned. Then came the invitation that broke through the fragile curtain of civility. A family gathering at Emily's penthouse. An event I was expected to attend, but not really belong to. The elevator ride up was a slow, suffocating climb, the polished walls reflecting my nervous face back at me from every angle. When the doors opened, the apartment gleamed with expensive taste and effortless elegance, but the smiles I was greeted with were tight, rehearsed. Conversations fluttered around me like butterflies that never landed. I caught the glimpse of a whispered joke behind my back, eyes darting away as I approached. Throughout the evening, I tried to engage, offering a story about my latest writing assignment, asking about Emily's new job, but the responses were clipped, distracted. Emily's friends clustered around her like a protective shield, their laughter ringing hollow, their glances dismissive. At one point, I found myself standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights twinkle below, feeling more like a spectator than a participant. A glass slipped from my hand, shattering on the marble floor. The room froze, and a single sharp intake of breath broke the silence. Emily's eyes flashed with irritation. Mom's smile tightened into something brittle. I bent to clean the shards, the cool glass cutting into my fingers, a physical sting that matched the ache inside. Back in my cramped apartment that night, I sat with bloodied fingers and bruised pride, the city skyline visible through my grimy window. The contrast was cruel, a glittering world just out of reach, a reminder of everything I wasn't allowed to be. The silence pressed in, but this time it wasn't numbness that filled me. It was a rising tide of something darker, an anger coiled tightly beneath years of neglect. Still, uncertainty gnawed at me. Was I overreacting? Was I reading too much into their actions? The doubt was a persistent shadow, whispering that maybe I was the one who needed to change, to fit their mold. But each cold look, each broken promise, each sharp dismissal chipped away at that hope, revealing the hard truth beneath. One night, as I lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling, my phone buzzed again. A new message from Mom, but this time it wasn't a request or a demand. Just a photo, a blurred, half-hidden snapshot of Emily in her penthouse, smiling with a glass of champagne in hand. The caption read simply, "Family first." The irony was as bitter as the late-night coffee I sipped. I stared at the screen until it went dark, the weight of the image pressing down like a silent challenge. And then, in the stillness, the faint sound of the elevator doors sliding open echoed through the building, a soft, deliberate creak that shattered the quiet. I sat up, breath caught, heart pounding. Something was coming, something that could no longer be ignored. That night, as the city hummed below like a restless beast, I sat hunched over my chipped kitchen table, the faint glow of my laptop the only light in the room. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, suspended between hesitation and resolve. The invitation to Emily's next party had come through hours ago, a message dripping with expectation and unspoken warning. I wasn't just expected to show up. I was expected to disappear, to be a prop in their carefully staged picture of success. But this time was different. I wasn't going to be invisible. The elevator in our building dinged sharply, and I heard the soft thud of footsteps in the hallway. Moments later, the doorbell rang. Sharp, insistent. I opened the door to find my mother, her expression unreadable, eyes flickering with something I couldn't place. Behind her, Emily's silhouette filled the doorway, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor. "I didn't expect you to answer," Mom said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Emily smirked, eyes narrowing. "Jake, you're coming with us. Tonight." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. I don't think that's a good idea." Mom's voice dropped to a cold whisper. "You don't have a choice. Dad told us you're either with the family or against it." The words hit like a hammer. Against it. The implication was clear. If I didn't play their game, I was out for good. Emily's laugh cut through the tension. "Maybe if you stopped sulking and started acting like part of this family, you wouldn't be such a disappointment." I clenched my jaw, the weight of years pressing down, but beneath it all, a spark flickered. Anger. Yes, but also something fiercer. Defiance. The ride up to the penthouse was suffocating. Emily and Mom exchanged sly glances, their whispered conversations a constant reminder that I was the outsider, the mistake. When the doors slid open, the apartment dazzled with its cold luxury. Crystal chandeliers reflected in polished marble floors, the sprawling skyline visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. But as I stepped inside, the illusion cracked. A group of Emily's friends turned to stare, their eyes sharp and unforgiving. A snide comment floated through the air, something about the family charity case. The laughter that followed was cruel and hollow. I felt my cheeks burn, the heat of humiliation rising. The room seemed to close in, the polished surfaces reflecting back my shame like a cruel mirror. Then, cutting through the noise, Mom's voice rang out with a chilling finality. "Jake, we brought you here to give you one last chance. If you can't prove you belong, if you can't become what we expect, then this family has no place for you." Emily stepped forward, her gaze icy. "You're either with us or against us. Make your choice." The words hung in the air like a guillotine's blade, sharp and inevitable. I looked around, searching for an anchor, but found only faces turned away in judgment. The penthouse, once a symbol of privilege, had become a cage. My fists clenched at my sides, knuckles white. Every insult, every dismissal, every cold shoulder led to this moment, a crossroads where I had to decide whether to bend, break, or fight back. The room seemed to pulse with expectation, the silence deafening. And then, as all eyes fixed on me, I took a breath, the first true breath I'd taken in years, and whispered, "I'm done being your failure." The words barely left my lips when the apartment plunged into a heavy, suffocating silence. The choice was mine, and whatever came next, it would change everything. The elevator ride down felt endless, each ding marking a heartbeat that pounded in my ears like a warning. When the doors finally opened, I slipped out into the dimly lit hallway, the cool air washing over me like a shock. I didn't look back. The penthouse's gleam, the polished floors, the crystal chandeliers, the city lights spilling from floor-to-ceiling windows, receded behind me, swallowed by the heavy silence I carried with me. That night, I didn't say a word on the walk home. My steps were slow, dragging against the pavement as if the weight of the evening pressed me down. The usual hum of the city felt muted, distant, like I was underwater, cut off from the noise and life around me. When I reached my apartment, I didn't bother turning on the light. Instead, I collapsed onto the sagging couch, the fabric rough against my skin, and stared at the ceiling, tracing cracks in the plaster like a map of every fracture inside me. The next morning, I woke with a stiff neck and a mouth coated with dryness. The sunlight slanting through my grimy window was harsh, unforgiving. I reached for my phone, half expecting a message from Mom or Emily, some new demand or insult. But the screen was empty. No texts, no missed calls. The silence was both a relief and a fresh kind of ache. I moved through the day with mechanical precision. I left the apartment earlier than usual, avoiding the elevator and taking the stairs instead. The climb was exhausting, my legs burning, but the effort felt like a punishment I deserved, or maybe a penance. At work, I stuck to the back of the diner, steering clear of the manager's glare and the regulars' casual disregard. I wiped tables with more force than necessary, my knuckles whitening as I gripped the rag. Every swipe was a small act of frustration, the repetitive motion grounding me even as my mind spun. Lunch came alone, as always, but today I sat facing the wall instead of the window. The sandwich tasted dry and bland, and I barely chewed before swallowing. My fingers drummed a restless rhythm on the tabletop, the sensation sharp and distracting. I caught my reflection in the diner's grimy mirror. Sunken eyes, a tight jaw, a face I barely recognized. The rawness in my hands from scrubbing toilets had started to fade, replaced by a dull ache deeper than muscle soreness. Back home, I avoided the living room altogether. The apartment felt smaller somehow, each familiar object a reminder of everything I wanted to escape. I spent hours in my bedroom, the curtains drawn tight against the world. I lay on the bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, fingers tracing idle patterns on the threadbare blanket. The nights were restless, sleep slipping through my grasp like smoke. Sometimes I caught myself whispering Emily's words under my breath, the sting of her laughter echoing in the quiet. A new habit crept in. I started writing again, but only in the dead of night, the glow of my laptop screen the only light in the darkness. The words came slow, hesitant, fragments of thoughts, half-formed sentences, the raw edges of anger and doubt bleeding through the lines. I didn't share them with anyone, not even the one person I'd once confided in. It felt too fragile, too exposed. One afternoon, after a shift that left me bone-tired, I found myself standing outside a small cafe I'd passed 100 times but never entered. The sign was faded, the door chipped, but something about the place pulled me inside. I ordered a black coffee, no sugar, and sat in a corner booth, the din of quiet conversations around me a strange comfort. My hands wrapped around the warm cup, fingers trembling slightly. I pulled out my phone and typed a message, short, simple. "Hey, can we talk?" I didn't expect an immediate reply. The screen sat dark, The blinking cursor a silent invitation. I felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Hope. Fear. Maybe both. It was the first time in weeks I'd reached out, broken the wall I'd built around myself. As the days passed, my routines shifted further. I left the diner early whenever I could, ducking into the city's back streets, letting the noise and motion blur the edges of my thoughts. At home, I stopped trying to clean up after family dinners, letting the dishes pile in the sink like small monuments to my retreat. I spoke less, smiled less, my voice a quiet ghost in the spaces I once tried to fill. But beneath the weight of exhaustion and isolation, a faint pulse stirred. Not a blaze, not yet, but the tiniest ember of something real. One night, as I stared at the blinking cursor on my laptop screen, I typed a single sentence, erased it, then typed it again. I'm still here. And for the first time in a long time, those words didn't feel like a surrender. They felt like a beginning. The morning light filtered weakly through the grime-coated window as I sat at the kitchen table, a cup of lukewarm coffee cooling in my hands. The silence around me was no longer oppressive. It felt more like a challenge I was willing to face. Last night's message, the one I'd sent out of a mix of desperation and hope, had finally gotten a response. It was from Marcus, my old neighbor, and the only person outside my family who'd ever genuinely cared. "Hey Jake, let's meet at the Park Cafe in an hour. Got some time to talk?" I stared at the screen a moment longer, then stood up and grabbed my coat. The streets were already buzzing with the city's usual chaotic rhythm as I made my way to the cafe. A small, sunlit place tucked between two towering skyscrapers. Marcus was already there, sitting at a corner table, his familiar easy smile softening the edges of my anxious heart. "Jake," he said, standing to greet me with a solid handshake. "It's been a while." "Too long," I admitted, sliding into the seat opposite him. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe without the weight of judgment pressing down. We talked about everything and nothing. Work, writing, the way life seemed to twist you into shapes you didn't recognize. When I finally confessed the barrage of family pressures and the suffocating expectations, Marcus listened without interruption. "You're not obligated to be anyone's punching bag," he said firmly. "Boundaries aren't just for other people. You get to set them too." His words were like a lifeline. We spent the afternoon mapping out small steps I could take. Therapy referrals, local writing groups, ways to start carving out space for myself without igniting another family war. That evening, I found myself scrolling through a list of therapists. I hesitated before finally booking an appointment with a counselor specializing in family dynamics. It wasn't a magic fix, but it was a declaration. I was choosing to invest in myself. The next day, I walked into the diner with a new sense of purpose. Instead of folding into the shadows, I greeted the manager, Mark, with a steady voice. When he snapped at me over a misplaced order, I took a breath and said, "I'm doing my best, but I'm also learning how to do better. I'd appreciate it if you could let me know what I need to improve without the attitude." Mark blinked, clearly surprised. "All right, Jake." Fair enough. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a crack in the dam. At home, I started setting small boundaries too. When Mom called to ask about dinner plans, I replied honestly that I needed some time to focus on my writing and mental health. The silence on the other end was sharp, but I didn't apologize or backtrack. One night, after a particularly draining shift, I sat at my laptop drafting a piece about resilience, how it didn't always look like victory. Sometimes it looked like simply refusing to disappear. My fingers hesitated over the keys before I typed the words, "I am enough." But the pull of old ties was relentless. When Emily texted me that weekend, inviting me to a brunch at the Penthouse, I felt the familiar sting of wanting to be seen and accepted. This time, though, I didn't reply right away. I spent hours weighing what it really meant to go, to walk back into a room where I'd been made to feel small, or to finally say no. I called Marcus instead. "Brunch at their place," I explained. "Feels like a test." He nodded. "It is. But you get to decide the rules." The morning of the brunch, I stood in front of my mirror, dressed in something that felt like me for the first time in years. When I arrived, the familiar cold smiles and whispered judgments greeted me, but I kept my chin up. I stayed only long enough to eat, to exchange a few words with Emily that weren't laced with bitterness. and then I left without apology. Walking back down the elevator, I felt something shift, a fragile sense of control returning to my hands. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, the city's lights flickering beyond the window, I realized this was only the beginning. The path ahead was uncertain, tangled with old wounds and fresh hopes alike. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. I was still here, and I was ready to fight for the life I deserved. The late afternoon sun slanted through the slats of my blinds, casting long shadows across the cluttered floor of my apartment. I sat on the edge of the worn-out couch, fingers tapping nervously against the faded fabric. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second a hammer driving my anxiety deeper. My phone lay face down on the coffee table, its silent presence both a comfort and a threat. I'd sent the message hours ago. Now, I just had to wait. When the knock finally came, my heart jumped into my throat. I stood, smoothing a hand over my shirt, an attempt to steady the trembling I couldn't quite hide. Opening the door, I found Mom standing there. No Emily, no Dad, just her. Her eyes held that familiar hardness, but beneath it flickered something softer, reluctant. "Hey," I said, voice uneven. She gave a curt nod, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and old books, a stark contrast to the sterile, eye-polished rooms she was used to. She glanced around, lips pressed tight. "Thanks for letting me in," I said, closing the door behind her. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she perched on the edge of my couch, hands folded neatly in her lap. I sat across from her, trying to read the unreadable expression on her face. After a long pause, she spoke. "Jake, I know things haven't been easy for any of us." Her words caught me off guard. Not because I doubted their truth, but because she rarely acknowledged the cracks in our family's facade. "I'm tired, Mom," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Tired of feeling like I don't belong. Like I'm just a mistake." She swallowed, eyes flickering away for a moment before meeting mine again. "That's not how it's supposed to be. You have to understand. We've had expectations. For Emily, for you. Different paths, sure, but paths we thought would lead somewhere." I shook my head. "No. You thought Emily was the only one worth investing in. You called me a failure. You made it clear I was less." The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. I could see the flicker of guilt in her eyes, quickly masked by a tight smile. "I'm sorry you feel that way," she said, voice low. "Maybe I didn't show you the support you needed. But you have to see it from our side, too. We wanted what was best." I leaned forward, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "Best? Best for who? For Emily? Because I was scraping toilets while she got a penthouse. You didn't want me. You wanted a version of me that fit your picture." Her eyes glistened, but she blinked rapidly, swallowing the lump rising in her throat. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I thought pushing you would make you stronger." I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow in the quiet room. "Stronger? You broke me. And then you acted like I was the problem." She looked away, biting her lip. The tension between us was raw and jagged, each word a small cut reopening old wounds. After a long moment, she spoke again, softer this time. "What do you want from me, Jake?" I exhaled slowly, searching for the right answer. "I don't want apologies that just patch over things. I want honesty. I want you to see me, not as a failure or a project, but as me. And I need you to stop pretending that Emily's life is the only one that matters." Her gaze met mine again, vulnerability flickering behind the walls she'd built. "I don't know if I can do that overnight. I'm not sure I even know how." "Neither do I," I said quietly. "But maybe that's a start." The room felt smaller, the weight of years pressing down. Yet in that shared discomfort, a fragile bridge began to form. We sat in silence, the ticking clock less a torment and more a reminder that time was moving forward, whether we were ready or not. Finally, she stood, hesitating at the door. "Thank you for inviting me in. I'll try. For both our sakes." I nodded. the knot in my chest loosening just a bit. As the door clicked shut behind her, I sank back onto the couch, the first real breath of release filling my lungs. The path ahead was uncertain, tangled and messy, but for the first time, the truth was out. No easy fixes, no clean endings, just the weight of what was real between us. And somehow, that felt like enough to begin. The days after Mom's visit unfolded like a slow, tentative dance, each step uncertain, each movement weighted with unspoken questions. When I woke the morning after she left, the apartment felt both emptier and somehow less oppressive. The silence wasn't a heavy blanket, but a fragile space waiting to be filled. I moved through my routine with a strange lightness, though the knot in my stomach reminded me that nothing had truly changed overnight. At work, the diner was the same cramped, fluorescent-lit world I knew too well, but something in me shifted. When Mark barked a correction about the coffee order, I didn't shrink back or bite my tongue. Instead, I nodded and said, "Thanks for letting me know. I'm working on it." His eyes flickered with surprise, but he just grunted and moved on. It was a small exchange, but it felt like a crack in the wall I'd built around myself. Back home, I found myself hesitating before opening my phone. Emily had sent a message that morning. "Hope you're okay. Let me know if you want to talk." For a moment, I stared at the words, the ghost of old wounds flaring up. Could I trust that? Was it genuine, or just another trap dressed in civility? I didn't reply right away. Instead, I set the phone down and paced the room, running my hands through my hair. When I finally texted back, it was a simple, cautious, "Thanks, I'm here." The next family dinner was a quiet test of boundaries. Mom arrived slightly later than usual, her smile softer but still tinged with that guarded reserve. Emily greeted me with a nod that lacked its usual sharpness, and Dad was quieter, less commanding. The table was set with the same polished china, but the air between us held a new texture, less brittle, though far from warm. Throughout the meal, I noticed small gestures I hadn't seen before. Mom poured me an extra glass of water without being asked. Emily shared a story that didn't revolve around status or success, but about a book she'd just read. Even Dad asked how work was going, his tone cautious but sincere. These moments weren't grand or transformative, but they were real, tiny threads weaving a tentative connection. Still, the old patterns lurked beneath the surface. When I mentioned a new article I was writing, Mom's eyes glazed over, and Dad quickly shifted the conversation to Emily's upcoming charity gala. The familiar sting of invisibility returned, reminding me that progress wasn't a straight line. It was messy, uneven, and fragile. That night, as I lay in bed, the silence settled around me like a fragile truce. I thought about the conversation with Mom, the raw honesty, the awkward pauses, the admission that neither of us had the answers. It was uncomfortable but necessary. For the first time, I glimpsed the possibility that healing wouldn't erase the past, but it might create space for something different. Over the following weeks, I noticed more subtle changes, not just in them, but in myself. I stopped retreating the moment tensions rose and instead tried to hold my ground. When Emily made a snide remark about my writing being a hobby, I took a breath and replied, "It's more than that to me." It wasn't a battle cry, just a quiet assertion of worth. Mom started calling more often, sometimes just to check in without an agenda. One afternoon, she showed up with a stack of old family photos, sitting with me as we flipped through memories I'd nearly forgotten. It was awkward and uneven, but beneath the surface, it felt like a seed being planted. Dad remained the hardest to reach. His approval felt like a distant summit, and on some days, his silence weighed heavier than any criticism. But even he began to acknowledge my efforts in small ways. A nod here, a brief, "Good job" there. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me moving forward. Work became a refuge and a challenge. I took on extra shifts, not because I wanted to prove anything to anyone else, but because I was learning to prove it to myself. The stains on the diner floor no longer felt like a sentence, but a reminder of persistence. And when Mark handed me a folded note one evening, a simple, "Thanks for hanging in there," I tucked it into my wallet like a secret victory. The hardest moments were the setbacks. There were nights when I'd replay old arguments, when the silence at the dinner table felt like a chasm I couldn't cross. Times when I doubted if any of this effort was worth it. if the fragile threads could hold under the weight of years of neglect. But then there were the micro-rituals that kept me anchored. A text from Marcus checking in, a shared cup of coffee with Mom, a brief, genuine smile from Emily before she slipped back into her guarded shell. Each one was a reminder that beneath the pain and distance, the family wasn't a lost cause, just a complicated, imperfect work in progress. One evening, as I sat by the window, the city lights flickering in the distance, I opened my laptop and began to write. Not an article, not a story, but a letter to myself. Words spilled out about resilience, about the messy, winding road of healing, and about the quiet power of choosing to keep moving forward. I paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard, and then typed the final line. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning. In that moment, with the hum of the city beneath me and the weight of the past still resting on my shoulders, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Hope. Not a promise of easy answers, but the fragile, stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, I could build a life worth fighting for. One small step at a time. Looking back, I realize now just how long I carried the weight of being the failure in my family. For years, I thought their rejection was a reflection of my worth, that I was less because I wasn't living the life they wanted for me. But the truth is, their expectations never matched who I really was or who I wanted to become. That distinction, between their version of success and my own, was something I couldn't see clearly until I finally stepped away from their narrative and started defining myself on my own terms. I remember the early mornings in my cramped apartment, the sting of scrubbing toilets, and the sharp edges of family dinners where I was invisible. Those moments didn't disappear, and I still carry some scars from them. But they don't control me anymore. Instead, they remind me of what I endured and what I survived. They're part of my story, but they're not my whole story. Learning to set boundaries was perhaps the hardest lesson. Saying no to Emily's invitations, pushing back against Mom's demands, and standing my ground at work, it felt like walking a tightrope. Each step risked falling back into old patterns of guilt and isolation. But with time, I discovered that protecting my own sense of self wasn't selfish, it was necessary. It allowed me to grow, to heal, and to start building relationships based on honesty rather than expectation. Speaking of relationships, things with my family are still complicated. Mom and I had a conversation that wasn't easy or neat, but it was real. I saw cracks in her armor, and she saw some of the pain she'd caused. That's a start, even if it's fragile. Emily remains distant, her own walls high, but I'm learning that some connections take longer to mend, or sometimes need to be left at a comfortable distance to protect my peace. And Dad, well, he's still hard to reach. But I'm no longer waiting for his approval to feel whole. Work and writing have become my anchors. The diner job taught me resilience in the face of disrespect, and my writing gave me a voice I never thought I had. Small victories, publishing an article, receiving a kind word from a manager, booking therapy appointments, have added up to something meaningful. They remind me that progress isn't about giant leaps, but consistent steps forward, even when the path is uncertain. What I've lost along the way is the illusion that family love is unconditional, or that success is measured by penthouses and status. What I've found is a clearer sense of who I am beyond those definitions, a person worthy of respect, compassion, and space to grow. I've learned that sometimes, you have to walk away from the story others write for you and start drafting your own, even if it means rewriting the narrative one day at a time. If there's one thing I want to leave you with, it's this. We all carry wounds, and sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who hurt us the most. But healing doesn't mean forgetting or pretending everything is fine. It means facing the truth, setting boundaries, and finding the courage to claim your own worth, no matter how long it takes. Have you ever had to redefine your place in a family or relationship? How did you find the strength to stand up for yourself? I'd love to hear your story. Feel free to share in the comments below. Sometimes, the hardest journeys are the ones worth talking about.